videos of our seminars, they are posted on YouTube, and you can get information on the website of Moscow School of Economics. And I hope, and I would also like to tell you that we previously planned that Sergei Rogov will be one of the speakers today, but he had some problems with internet, and so we decided to shift Sergei to May 12. He succeeded in joining us today. That's very good, and I hope that on May 12th he's going to be the speaker at our seminar. But today we have two excellent speakers, Professor J.Sholte, Jan Sholte. He is from Netherlands, but he used to work in London School of Economics, in Sweden, in Stockholm School of Economics, and he is also the visiting professor of Moscow School of Economics. Now, as far as I know, he is going to go to Leiden University. He is a very well-known specialist, political scientist, and I am sure that his presentation will be very interesting for all of us. And also we have another outstanding speaker today, Alexey Gromyko, who is member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and also he is the director of the Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Now I would like once more to ask those who haven't done so before to register themselves in chat, and those who haven't switched off their sound, please do so now, and we'll leave sound only for our speakers. And then when we will put questions and make comments, then of course we'll switch on the sound for us. So please, I would like to ask Jan to begin. Please, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you everyone for coming along. It says I cannot share screen while the other participant is sharing. I don't know.
No, I stopped my sharing, so you'll be able to share your screen. Please do.
Okay. Let's see. Are you seeing something?
Yes. Yes.
Let's make it.
Yes, it's okay.
Bigger. Okay. So thanks very much. Today it's more a discussion about the political institutions around COVID-19 and the prospects for global cooperation. Well, quickly, people were asking me where I was. I was in Geneva. I just show you quickly what it is to travel internationally at the moment. All of us are sitting in our homes, but if you attempt to travel internationally as I did last week, then this is what greets you at one airport, and this is what greets you at the check-in, and this is what greets you in the corridor, and this is what greets you on arrival in your destination, where there is also an empty check-in. So it's quite a strange experience at the moment. And just as a little laughing thing, these are the birds in Geneva who apparently have also learned to social distance.
Very special treatment. No.
Yeah. Anyway, but to our issue, we have a global challenge, the COVID-19, and people are saying yes, we need global coordination. But is there, in fact, a global response to the global challenge? And if we look at this COVID-19, what do experiences around it suggest about the problems and the prospects of global cooperation today? I was interested last week that Alexei Kireyev said, we need international cooperation more than ever. And Alexander Nikipilov, you all then said, yeah, but the trend is away from international cooperation. So there were kind of contrasting views. And so I spent the day since then thinking about what is the situation indeed around global cooperation. Since our last seminar, we had Antonio Guterres of the United Nations say that the world was not able to come together and face COVID-19 in an articulated, coordinated way. So that is a fairly negative view of the whole thing. And let's see. What we can say is that global cooperation perhaps has four tasks, four stages in a way of tasks. One is to coordinate the control of the disease. So, I mean, we cannot stop COVID-19 without stopping it everywhere across the planet at some point. So we have to coordinate the control. Once we start having more transactions again, then we need some coordination, global coordination of how we resume travel and trade and so on. I'm of a view that actually we will probably return to pre-pandemic levels of a lot of transactions. I'm not sure that global supply chains are going to stop, that global financial markets and the like are going to stop. I have a feeling that when we had the financial crisis, the migration crisis and so on in earlier times, the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, actually things returned relatively quickly. I think they're going to return more slowly this time, but I'm not sure that COVID-19 is the beginning of a deglobalization in some systemic total sense anyway. But there's a task of coordinating the resumption of global transactions. There's a task of coordinating the recovery then, coordinating the fiscal, the monetary, the employment, all the other policies. And coordinating these things in a way that takes attention to the uneven impacts that this crisis is having. The impacts, uneven impacts between countries, but between classes, sometimes genders and races as well. And then finally, coordinating prevention and preparation for the next time. Because if we look at recent years, we've had Zika, we've had Ebola, we've had SARS, we've had swine flu, we've had COVID now. It's unlikely that this sort of thing is going to go away. And many people have been saying we need global coordination in terms of mechanisms of prevention and preparation. Bill Gates famously in 2015 made comments about this, but many others have done so as well. So everyone constantly calling for coordination of prevention and preparation, but we've never actually done it much. Will this experience of COVID-19 make that then finally happen? In practice, of course, we've had a lot of unilateralism. So the record, as Antonio Guterres says, doesn't look very good at the moment. Lots of national and subnational governments, states in the United States, even local governments, are all taking their own policy approaches. They take different timetables, different measures, different statistics, different narratives about so the coordination is not very much looking in that regard. The European Union can't even get a solidarity package amongst its own members together with any ease. Yeah, when the crisis was starting in China they were blaming U.S. Military intelligence for sneaking in with things, and now the U.S. is blaming China, and so this is not very conducive to global cooperation either. Our current crop of national leaders, if we can call them that, many of them don't seem to be very eager to engage in international cooperation. And we don't really have a leading state. The liberal world order may be on shaky ground, but there's no particular leading state coming in the place of the United States to lead things. And to me, it's quite interesting to compare the financial crisis of 12 years ago when there was United States convening. I'm not making a comment about whether US leadership is good or bad, but the point is there was a leading state taking a leading role. And at the moment, in today's COVID, there's no leading state taking a leading role, whichever state that might be. I want to step back for a moment, though, and look at some data that might be of interest. On the eve of the COVID-19 outbreak, colleagues and I actually did a survey of elites in 6 countries: Brazil, Germany, Philippines, Russia, South Africa, and USA. So across different world regions, different political cultures, different economic development levels, different geopolitical positions, as well as the transnational elite group. And we wanted to see how far they are primed for global cooperation, how far they would like to make global arrangements to deal with policy issues as opposed to a national focus. And I think there's some interesting results here, which suggest that actually, once you get beyond the protectionist rhetoric of the Trumps and so on, elites in the world are actually perhaps more ready for global cooperation and global coordination than the headlines in the media say. If you look here for a minute, you can see that the light blue, this is 10 different policy areas, 10 different policy issues. And this is the proportion of those elites that we surveyed who prefer. We asked them, at what level do you think a particular policy issue should be handled? And if you see here, human rights and environment, trade, and even migration, the largest proportion of people say that the elites say that the global level, global governance should be dealing with taking the lead on these issues more than national government. The darker blue lines in the middle are the national government levels. And you can see also for health, in fact, if you look at the global and the regional, the preference for global and regional governance, if you add those two up together, they are about the same level as the national level. So, okay, and then as we move into other topics like defense, taxation, education, and employment, then the national level is clearly preferred. But I find it interesting here that even in this day of so-called protectionism and nationalism and so on and so forth, in fact, elites across these different countries are showing quite a bit of inclination for global level governance. It varies by country. It varies by country, and you can see that if you compare the 6 countries that we looked at, and the global elite, a transnational elite, so people working for international organizations and the like, you can see there's a variation. So in the case of Germany, adding up the preference for global and regional level, that comes to be 7.3 out of 10 issues. So a very strong preference for supra-state governance in Germany. Whereas if you go to the other, in this case, lower extreme of Russia, then in Russia, if you add up the preference for global and regional governance, it's quite a bit lower than that for national governance. But there's a variation across countries, and maybe it's good to remember that if you're in a country which has a low inclination to look to global governance, it doesn't mean that the rest of the world is maybe in the same place. There may be different priorities. Then here we can look in the case of Russia, the Russian elites, you can see that on the whole, the preference for global level governance is rather lower than the overall average. In the case of some topics like employment and education and taxation, it's almost zero. Okay, so this suggests that elites are relatively ready to engage in global coordination and global cooperation, especially in some areas. If we then look at how people feel about existing global governance institutions, so we asked all these elites how they judged existing global institutions and whether they find those global institutions to work well. And here, they're the confidence that they have in these institutions. And you can see here that, in fact, the World Health Organization, the WHO, came out as having the highest confidence levels on average. It's still not a super high score, 2.1 on a scale to 3, but it's reasonably high. But for global governance in general, the global institutions in general, the ratings are sort of in the middle. Not very enthusiastic, but not hugely critical either, except for FIFA, which is the rather scandal-ridden football association. But for the rest, it's all kind of middle of the road. So putting these two questions together, we can say that elites on the whole are quite ready to think about global governance, global coordination in principle, but when it comes to the actually existing arrangements for global coordination, they're less enthusiastic. Here again, you see some variation between the countries. If you take all of those institutions and the average scores, then as you see in most countries, it's a little bit more towards the confidence side. In South Africa and Russia, a bit lower. And if you look at the Russian scores again more specifically, then you see that Russian elite judgments about a number of institutions again varies a bit compared to is sometimes similar. So the WHO score is quite similar, but some of the other scores are quite different. I find it interesting that the Russian elite average gives relatively greater confidence to United Nations multilateral institutions. So you see the United Nations Security Council towards the left at 1.87. Also the G20, where Russia has a considerable voice. The United Nations, the WHO, and then lower scores for the global economic institutions, where Russian experience of IMF, World Bank, WTO is perhaps relatively more negative than in other countries. So again, varies, and the confidence in NATO is not surprising. Okay, but if we look at the global coordination in relation to COVID, where can we find it? We might look at the United Nations system, the traditional multilateral system, and this is what was discussed with Alexei Kireev last week in particular. So what can the IMF do? What can the United Nations do? What can the World Health Organization do, and so on. And eventually we'll be asking the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, to help coordinate the resumption of air travel, and so on and so forth. This is, if you like, the whole traditional multilateral global coordination. But this has severe limits, and I would caution to how far we would look to this traditional multilateralism for our global coordination. We've seen in a whole sequence of global crises of the last 20, 30 years that the United Nations and the traditional multilateral system just hasn't really come up to, hasn't provided the degree and the quality of global coordination that's wanted. So in the financial crisis, the UN system took much of a backseat. The climate crisis, how many climate meetings haven't we had over the 30 years, and limited progress. In the migration crisis of 2015, again, the multilateral system not really doing too much, and in the corona at the moment. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised about that, because if we look at WHO, the World Health Organization, even before President Trump suspended the US contribution, the budget of WHO is about the same as the budget of the city of Atlanta, and the staff numbers of the WHO is just over 1/3 of the staff numbers for Moscow State University. So, I mean, if you imagine that we looked at 1/3 of the staff of Moscow State University and said, okay, solve the global health problem, this is not something that's going to happen very often. And even if we look at the United Nations total budget, the central budget of the whole United Nations, again, it's really very, very small. And to expect them that global cooperation through the United Nations system is going to give us enough decisions, enough compliance, enough implementation, it's probably not going to happen. And so it doesn't surprise me that we should probably look for global cooperation to take place elsewhere than the traditional multilateral system. And I think if you look at the activities of so-called trans-governmental networks, that means informal collaborations, not based on treaties, involving civil servants rather than government than politicians. If you look at that kind of global coordination, then I think you can find around COVID-19 quite a bit more happening. So the group of 7 and the group of 20, when it comes to the politicians and the leaders, there's not so much happening there. But if you look at the OECD, its committees, its expert and working groups, and all of the information sharing and policy learning and policy transfers that they are doing, at that level, there's a much more coordination and cooperation happening. Likewise amongst national health ministries, likewise amongst national centers of disease control. So I think when we are being pessimistic about levels of global coordination, it's often because we are thinking about the United Nations system and the traditional conventional multilateralism. But these days, a lot of other global coordination is happening in other kinds of ways, including these transgovernmental ways. Also including translocal, it means when cities come together and when provinces exchange things rather than national governments. And I list here a few of occasions where some COVID-19 global coordination is happening between cities and between states. And it makes sense because the COVID hotspots are usually large cities and certain regions of countries. They are not the country as a whole. So in Russia, the problem is Moscow, and the problem is certain urban areas in particular, and less Russia as the overall country. Likewise, quietly, we are also seeing multi-stakeholder arrangements rather than multilateral arrangements. A multi-stakeholder global cooperation happens when it isn't governments who come together, but it's business and technicians and civil society groups as well as governments. And I list here a couple of examples of global coordination through the so-called multi-stakeholder arrangement. And if you look even at their budget levels, some of these in the health area, you can see that their budgets are similar to or greater than the World Health Organization, even now, even already. And this may be a trend that continues into the future. So just to finish, I don't feel myself that COVID-19 is going to give us an end of globalization and a return to national economies, national societies without intense global connections with each other. I think that we're probably going to go back in that direction. Maybe less air travel, maybe less certain kinds of connections, but a lot more connections of the virtual kind that we are having in this webinar, for example. So I think we are still going to have a global world to deal with, and we will continue to have tension between more unilateral and more global cooperation responses to that global connection. I don't see anything in the history of the last 30 years that suggests we are going to have any expansion, any growth of resources or policy or problem-solving capacity in the conventional multilateral United Nations type of global cooperation. So there's a functional need for global cooperation. As I said earlier, elites are broadly ready to engage in global cooperation, but the traditional ways of doing global cooperation, I really think are probably not going to deliver. So I think we probably are going to see more global cooperation in these other ways: informal, multi-stakeholder, city to city, province to province, ministry to ministry, and again, probably those traditional ways staying in the background. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. It was great. Thank you for this presentation. Very interesting. Very interesting. Dear friends, probably you stop sharing right now.
Yeah.
Great. So I propose now we listen to our second speaker, Alexey Gromyko, and then we'll put questions to both speakers and make comments. Or would you prefer to deal at first with Jan and then to give the floor to Alexei.
To give floor to Alexei. The best idea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Alexei, so the floor is yours. Mm-hmm. So please keep switched off your microphones. Mm-hmm. Alexei, do you hear me? Oh, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I was asked to speak broadly on the events connected to pandemic, about certain social and economic consequences of what is going on. And I would like to start with something what I heard recently, and I liked it very much. And somebody said that sometimes there are decades when almost nothing happens, but sometimes there are weeks when decades are passing by. And I think that we are living through one more stage in our life and in history when events are moving very fast. And when consequences of what is going on may have a very long-term echo. First of all, it seems to me that in spite of all extraordinary things which we have been witnessing and are going to witness in the next weeks and months, still the post-pandemic world perhaps is going to look like more or less the same as the world before the pandemic. And a lot depends on how close to our hearts and to our senses, to our feelings, we take what we see and what we hear. Now we are looking through a microscope to find out what is going on. But I think that as the time runs by and the intensity of this drama abides, the microscope is going to be replaced by a magnifying glass, and the magnifying glass will be replaced by a telescope, and the sharpness of our perception of this drama will decrease in the course of time. So I think that most radical forecasts are not going to fruition. But that does not mean that a lot of changes are not going to happen. Well, we can be guided by history and remember how the world changed after Great Depression, and quite recently after Great Recession. Quite often these days we hear different analogies with the world wars or with the breakup of the USSR. So with something very profound what happened in the 20th century in Europe and beyond. From my point of view, these parallels are not very correct. I think that we should try to discern between those changes which are effect of life during the pandemic, and those changes which are going to stay with us when the pandemic becomes a page of history. And it seems to me that those changes which are going to stay with us are not necessarily something totally new, some breakthroughs into the future. I think that some changes will be a certain return to some ideas and processes and practices which we know from history. Of course, these days, and not just these days, but in the past years and even decades, when we are speaking about economy, we imply politics. And when we speak about politics, usually we imply economics. In other words, we apply political economy. And I think that in order to analyze the consequences of pandemic, it is impossible not to apply political economy. It seems to me that either now or before the pandemic, we are speaking about toughening of economic, information, technological, and other forms of competition. Globalization has been turning and is turning from the self-regulatory, self-regulating economic process into political instruments to suppress your business competitors, including with the application of arbitrary restrictions, of extraterritorial application of national law, with the application of different decisions bypassing World Trade Organization and other multilateral institutions. It seems to me that even before the pandemic, it was a fact of life that many key problems in global and trans-regional and regional development were not solved, including those problems which caused the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And it seems to me that due or because of the pandemic, even more difficult times are coming. For example, the geopolitical competition between China and the United States are getting worse, not better. The process of strategic decoupling between the United States and its European allies continues. And we all remember that we started to discuss pandemic very intensively in probably in the second half of February, in March. And of course, since that time, a lot has been said and written. So it is getting more and more difficult not to repeat yourself or somebody else. But still, I think that there are a lot what is yet not very banal in discussing COVID-19 and its consequences. And of course, the question is how the day after is going to look like. And I think that most who are taking part now in this discussion remember quite well 1983, when a famous movie the day after was released in the United States. And in Russia, it was shown in a bit later, as far as I remember, in 1987, the day after. The movie was about the world the day after the nuclear war. Of course, these days, nobody or almost nobody is trying to put forward some apocalyptical forecasts. And of course, when we use now this expression, the day after, we usually mean that sooner or later, but we will return to certain situation which we call business as usual. Some sort of normalization is going to happen with all corrections and reservations which are going to take place. But of course, I do not want to say that that we should embrace complacency. Not at all. I belong to those group of specialists who think that the pandemic is going to aggravate those negative trends in global development, which we saw for quite a long time before COVID-19. And it seems to me that some of these trends are really threatening. Quite threatening. And for example, we have been speaking a lot about dangers of military accidents, and usually we were commenting on situation between Russia and NATO. And we were saying that even some minor incidents may morph quite quickly into uncontrollable spiral of confrontation. Okay, now there are few pieces of news dedicated to confrontation between Russia and NATO, but there is something else. And it seems to me that this something else is much worrisome than the previous reason to be frightened. And this is the confrontation and possible military confrontation between China and the United States. And it seems to me that there are a lot of big forked fuses which can ignite if a certain set of circumstances emerge. For example, such a big forked fuse may be found somewhere on the shores of Taiwan. Of course, this problem is very well known, and I'm not going to go very deep. But for example, what is going on just these days? A couple of days ago, I saw certain pieces of news and information that the State Department of the United States launched quite an active campaign in social networks on the topic of membership of Taiwan in the World Health Organization. What does it mean? It means that this campaign may become one of first steps in trying to push forward the recognition of independence of Taiwan. And of course, yesterday or the day before yesterday, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China expressed its protest. In Russia, we know very well the expression, the last China warning. By the way, it is rooted in the history of confrontation between China and the United States back in the 50s and in the 60s, last century. And by the way, that confrontation was because of Taiwan. But what we are witnessing now is that the United States, especially against the backdrop of the forthcoming presidential election in the United States, may try to use this topic somehow to press China. But we know that for China, Taiwan and certain actions which the United States may try to do is a real red line. So why not to be threatened, and why not to fear a certain development which the pandemic may make even more pronounced, and which may lead to very major events on the verge of regional and even trans-regional military escalation. But let's now return to more banal sides of the pandemic. Now, a lot of people discuss possibilities of vaccine, how fast the vaccine is going to be invented. There is some optimism that it can happen by the end of the current year. Still, most specialists say that probably that is too fast, and we should wait till the middle of next year before the vaccine is invented, tested, and produced in industrial proportions. But let's ask ourselves a different question. What is going on if the vaccine is not invented at all? Or if it is invented not this year, not by the middle of next year, but in a much more distant time in the future? And if all reliance on so-called population immunity is not going to be realized. I would like just to remember then that which infection speed was registered first in 1983, as far as I remember. So almost 40 years have passed, but still no vaccine. Or something less, probably still less life-threatening as dengue fever. Dengue fever is with us for dozens of years, but no vaccine. So if our plan A is not going to be realized, then what about plan B? Plan B is how to accommodate COVID to our world, and how to make our life possible with permanent elements of quarantine. And already we know very well what does it mean to live in a world of quarantine, self-isolation in many varieties, which we have been seeing in many countries, in dozens of countries across the planet, including Russia. Of course, the human life is sacrosanct, but already de facto, we have seen that some countries, although without stating it publicly, they tried to, let's call it so, not to block the spread of epidemic, thinking that it is not possible to block this spread. And what was the reason not to block the spread of epidemic? The reason was to reach the peak of the pandemic as far as possible. And maybe that may cost more human lives, but if you think in terms of the interests of the society or of the economy, then why not to risk, with certain number of lives, but to save the economy, to save many people who are quite wealthy, who do not feel, the influence of pandemic, to save them from poverty, from unemployment, etc., etc. So it seems to me that not just applauding to the doctors, but a certain cynicism is very deep rooted in how many states or societies are trying to get over this problem. So let's imagine that the vaccine is not invented in the near future. Then who is going to lose and who is going to win? Well, it seems to me that everything which is connected to remote work, to social distancing in business places, in the restaurants, in pubs, in malls, in business centers, these spheres of life may be transformed very fundamentally. Of course, the production, the invention and production of software, of telecommunication systems will be booming soon. For example, now we are conducting this meeting on Zoom platform. And you know that Zoom platform has become just in 2-3 months something what millions of people are using, and just 2-3 months ago they didn't hear about Zoom. Or, for example, Sky Business platform also is getting more and more popular these days, with millions of people joining the application of Sky Business. Of course, 5G equipment and infrastructure, the Internet of Things, I think that these spheres are going to get a huge boost due to the experience of the pandemic. Well, and what is going to happen with airports, with rail stations? Just to remind us that 20 years ago, that was a shock for us to take off our coats, our shoes, our boots, our belts, etc., etc., in the airports, and that was a very energetic discussion in many societies about the balance between the human rights and new security measures. It seems to me that the pandemic is going to change this balance much further. For example, for a long time to go, we may be asked or demanded to wear medical masks. Or, for example, the new norms are going to be introduced in airplanes or in cars, in rail cars. And what does it mean? That the price for getting to a plane or to a rail car is going to skyrocket, and only one class of passengers are going to remain. This is the first class passengers. So a lot which we have used to think as something what is automatically a part of our life is going to evaporate, or at least to change very significantly. Well, of course, deep changes are going to happen in the sphere of health services. And I think that the role of the state is going to get much higher in the sphere of health services. I think that the city design, the approach to how our cities look like, the approach to public transport infrastructure is going to be influenced very heavily by the pandemic. It seems to me that this is a very good time to dwell on the philosophy of megacities. Megacities is something what, for example, Russia suffers very much. You know, this gigantism with making huge cities even bigger, like the project which is called Bigger Moscow. This philosophy seems to me to be undermined by the pandemic very heavily. One more problem is the problem of poor countries or developing countries. The problem and also a problem which is linked. Sorry, somebody is speaking. And the problem which is linked to the problem of poor countries, the problem of migration flows, of refugee camps. For example, now the bulk of the news are dedicated to the pandemic. And how many of us have heard about hunger riots in Lebanon? And I would like to remind that hunger riots in Lebanon started to happen before the pandemic. And in the beginning of 2020, the World Bank released the new statistics which showed that 45% population of just one country, 45% of the population of Lebanon were in need of foodstuff, were in need of food aid. And just in 2018, Lebanon, in GDP terms per head of the population, was one of the richest countries in the Arab world. I mean those countries which do not extract oil. If you take the information which the government of Lebanon released just a couple of weeks ago, then you will see that now, this is according to the government in Lebanon, 75% of the population of this country are in need of aid food. Or take Greece. In Greece, there are 100,000 people who claim the status of refugee. 100,000. So most of them are from Africa or the Middle East. 40,000 refugees from these 100,000 live in on islands, on Greek islands. And there are a lot of cases when there are bursts, explosions of virus in those places. One more issue. On the 23rd of April, the Conference of the United Nations on Trade and Development published a new report. And the main idea of this report is a very stark warning that the debt catastrophe of poor countries is approaching. According to the International Monetary Fund, the minimum volume of money which is needed to prevent this debt catastrophe is $2.5 trillion, and this is minimum. But what we saw when the last virtual summit of G20 took place, the only decision which they took was to restructure certain debts of the poor countries. We speak about not very big sum, to put it mildly, $40 billion, and at the same time we're speaking about 76 countries which are in debt and which are experiencing or will experience for sure very heavy problems due to increase of debt of these countries. And now one more point on the confrontation between China and the United States. In the past 2-3 weeks, there is a new narrative which is pressed very hard in the United States. And this is a narrative how to make China to lose its sovereign immunity. In other words, what does it mean to lose sovereign immunity? It means to default on a certain part of US obligations, and the volume of these obligations is about $1 trillion. And 1 trillion is something what Donald Trump and some other people mentioned, speaking about losses which the United States suffered because of the pandemic. And if China is responsible for the pandemic, then this loss of $1 trillion is the direct consequence of irresponsibility of China. So the logic goes. Trump was asked on a couple of occasions if he really thinks that the United States may default, deliberately may default on obligations to China. And he was cautious, and also he mentioned a second way to, let's say, to settle this problem, to put new tariffs on China goods, to put new tariffs. But what $1 trillion means, this is 1/3 of all currency and gold reserves of China. So we're speaking of very big things which may happen. This is not fantasy. This may take place, both the recognition of Taiwan or the default of the United States on obligations to China. And now a couple of words on the situation in Europe, and particularly in the European Union, but only in case if I'm given 2-3 more minutes by our moderator, Alexander Dmitrich. Do I have more 2-3 minutes or not?
Please, Alexei, you are welcome.
Okay, thank you. So the International Monetary Fund thinks that the GDP of the Eurozone this year is going to fall by 7.5%. There is a data from the European Commission which says that the GDP of the whole European Union this year will fall by 10%. And you know that when the authorities are saying something, then probably the situation is going to be worse than predicted. The according to official figures, the GDP of Germany this year is going to contract by 6.3%. The GDP of France is going to fall by 8%. Christine Lagarde even put forward a much worse scenario, and she did it online or officially. She said that the worst scenario implies the decrease of the GDP of the Eurozone by 15%. And if we compare these figures with the worst year of great recession, the worst year for the European Union, that was 2009. So in 2009, the GDP of the European Union fell by 4.5%. So now we are speaking of the decrease, which is going to be at least double in size than back in 2009. Of course, the first line of defense against the pandemic was the national states of the European Union, and this is clear, because up to now, the sphere of health service is something what the member states of the European Union take as their sovereign right. What happened? Spain took a decision to use the fund of 200 billion euros to support its economy. And what does it mean, 200 billion euro for Spain? This is 1/5 of the economy of this country. Or take Italy. On the national level, not on the supranational level, on the national level of Italy, they have introduced already 2 packages. The first package was in the amount of 350 billion euros to help the population. The second package was 400 billion euros to help business. And if you sum these 2 figures, 350 and 400, then you are going to get half of the GDP of this country, half of its GDP. The second line of defense was the European Central Bank. And you know that it acted very quickly, and it announced the program of 750 billion euros to buy state and corporate obligations within the Eurozone. And now let's take something else, the problem which is looming large. And this problem is called state deficit. So the state deficit of Italy before the pandemic was 135% of its GDP. Now they say that by the end of the year, the state deficit, the state debt of Italy will increase to 155%. And I think that in real life, the figure will be much higher. The situation is also very complicated with the state, with budget deficits. If you might remember that the problem of budget deficits was solved 2 or 3 years ago, and not a single country of the European Union surpassed, the red line of the Pact of Stability and Growth of the European Union before the pandemic. And this is 3% of budget deficit, 3% of GDP of each nation state of the European Union. So now, according to Italian authorities, the budget deficit of this country by the end of this year will be 10.4%. But let's take much healthier country in the European Union in terms of finances, the Netherlands. And what we see, that the situation in the Netherlands is going to be, in terms of budget deficit, even worse than in Italy by the end of this year. Now they say that the budget deficit of the Netherlands by the end of this year is going to be 11.8%. So this is 4 times higher than just a couple of months before. And just one more minute on the problem of state debt. So the average state debt in the European Union before the pandemic was around 80% of GDP of the European Union. The highest was in Greece, which was 180%. In Portugal, it was 120. In Belgium, Spain, Cyprus, more than 100. In the United Kingdom, it was more than 80%. And this is taking into consideration that according to the Maastricht criteria and to the Pact of Stability and Growth of the European Union, the ceiling for state debt of member states is 60% of GDP. In France, by the end of this year, the authorities expect the state debt of this country to increase to 115%. And what about percents which these countries need to spend to cover their state debt? Let's take just 2 or 3 countries. Already in 2018, Italy had to spend 3.7% of its GDP to serve its state debt. Portugal in 2018 spent 3.5% of its GDP to serve its state debt. Greece spent 2.5%, etc. etc. And what is the logic with all those measures which the nation states of the European Union are taking these days? That their state deficits, their budget deficits, the percentage of their GDP which they need to spend to cover their, to serve their state debts, all these figures are going to increase very significantly, not just this year, but the next year as well. And probably just one more minute on two more problems of the European Union. One problem is how to prevent the divergence, the further divergence of economies of the European Union. And you know how Italy, Spain, and even France have been pushing hard for introduction of corona bonds in the European Union. Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria, and Finland, and some other countries said no. The other problem is the next 7 years budget of the European Union, the budget for 21-27. Nothing is clear. The European Union was deeply divided between several groups even before the pandemic on the question of what should be the shape and content of the next budget of the European Union. And of course, these days, these conflicts and different interpretations have become even worse. But I would like just to conclude my talk by saying that it is clear that Brexit, which happened in January this year, is not going to spread further into the European Union. By the way, Brexit already inflicted a very big hole in the budget of the European Union, minimum 40 billion euros, and they didn't know how for sure close this hole of 40 billion euros. But now the European Union is going to experience a hole of 10 times bigger, or maybe 20 times bigger, or 30 times bigger. So this is a very serious question. But still, if we take into consideration those measures which have been taken on the level of nation states, on the level of European Central Bank, on the supranational level of the European Union, we may predict that definitely the EU is going to experience its worst recession since the Second World War, the recession much bigger than the previous one in 2009. But at the same time, probably next year, or by the end of 2022, not next year, but by the end of 2022, the EU may reach the level of development which they had prior to the pandemic. So the damage is huge, but it seems that it is not going to lead to any catastrophic or apocalyptic events in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexei, for this presentation of trends in the world as a whole and in Europe in particular. It was very interesting indeed. And just before putting questions and making comments, I would like to say that quite a lot of our colleagues from Uzbekistan have joined us. You are welcome, dear colleagues, and the rector of Economic University from Tashkent, Professor Sharipov, is one of them. So please, the floor is open for questions and comments. You are welcome just to raise your hands, either using this reaction button, or just tell me or write in chat that you would like to make comments or put questions. I'll try to follow chat as well. Yes, please.
Sergei Dubinin is speaking. I would like to ask Alexei in these issues about the indebtedness of the governments in the world. Let us remember that Japan government debt is more than 235% of GDP during last about 15 years. Certainly, it's not the best situation. I am against so huge indebtedness, but they live without catastrophic results in economy. Certainly without COVID problems, before COVID problems. What is your scenario? Is it possible that Eurozone or United States will come to this benchmark more than 250% and live suddenly in stagnation with a low rate of GDP growth, but without so huge problems for the population, for the economy, or something in other scenario more difficult you can predict? Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, shall I reply now or later when we collect questions?
Yes, I believe it's better to reply right now.
Okay.
Just what I ask you is to be quite short, you know.
Okay. Okay, fine. Thank you very much for the question, and this is a very good question. And the example of Japan is being drawn quite often. Well, first of all, Japan is one of the biggest economies. The European Union is a single market, but not to the extent of the fully integrated market of any nation state like Japan. Secondly, you are totally right that it is possible to live with huge debts, but then it means to live in stagnation. The ambitions of the European Union are such that it would be unbearable for the European Union to live the next 5 or 20 years in stagnation. Because what will it mean in practice? You might remember that when the new Commission of the European Union was formed in November last year, they called themselves the Geopolitical Commission. And their main slogan was the Green Deal. The Green Deal implied that the European Union by 2050 should become carbon or climate neutral economy. That would mean a huge reconstruction and modernization of the EU economy. They were going to launch the so-called Just Transition Fund, which should have at its disposal 1 trillion euros, 1 trillion euros. So it seems to me that now all these plans, if not all, but a lot of these plans and ambitions are, very dubious. Because if you live in such a debt, and if this debt increases by 2-3 times, then the only way to sustain this debt is to live in stagnation. And one more point: still, the European Union is not a state. There is no, no single bank market, no single market of capitals. And the problem is that if mutualization of bonds happens, this is one thing. Then the EU can live as Japan with 200% of state debt. But up to now, we have a situation when each member state of the European Union serves its own debt. And that's why the EU spent 400 billion euros to save Greece from bankruptcy in 2015. So for the European Union, as far as I see it, it is impossible to increase debt without consequences, like for Japan or for the United States. And sooner or later, one more Greek-like crisis is going to happen with Italy or with Spain or with Portugal or with some other country. And then euro may become the main victim. But the breakup of the Eurozone is a nightmare for the European Union. This is something what may lead to the collapse of the European Union per se. That's why, from my point of view, the significant increase in state debt of the European Union is much more dangerous than in case of Japan and, well, some other nation states.
Thank you, Alexei. Yes, colleagues, you are welcome to put more questions or make comments. I would like to ask Jan. Jan, I enjoyed your presentation very much. It was really very interesting. If I understood you correctly, your idea is that globalization will go on, but in different forms. So a kind of institutional restructuring of globalization will take place. What I would like to ask you is, how do you define globalization? Because a lot depends on definition here, because, one thing is just to say that globalization is something equal to permanently increasing amount of economic ties in different areas and political ties and all that. Another thing is to treat globalization as a movement toward the uniformity of economic space, As far as I understand it, the previous understanding of globalization was more inclined to the second treatment. I mean that the idea was that market space is becoming more and more uniform. Some governmental functions are given to high international levels and all that. But what you are saying is quite different from this. Please, I would like to know your understanding of this process. Thank you.
No, thank you, Alexander. Yeah, it opens up a huge question, and you're quite right. saying globalization is going to continue or not depends very much on your definition of globalization, and different ideas will lead you to different conclusions. The idea that globalization is the move towards a single open world economy is one conception of globalization, especially found in economic analysis. The notion that globalization is increased connectivity between people on a planetary scale, which could happen at the same time that there are considerable state restrictions and restrictions towards an open economy. That other idea, if you like, I think is probably more widespread in other fields of social research. So you're right, when people can talk past each other a little bit in those senses. Globalization in the sense of movement towards a single open world economy, that to some extent has been under pressure for some time. I mean, the Doha round has stalled for endless time. The tariff trade, so-called trade wars between China and the United States are ongoing before the pandemic. There are plenty of moves away from multilateralism towards bilateral treaties in trade and so on and so forth. But if you consider a globalization to be a deep interconnectivity amongst people across the planet, then climate change is a deep global connectivity. Well, climate change isn't going away whether people put up tariffs or not. And the growth of ICTs, information digitization, global digitized communications of the kind that we have in this conference, this continues whether or not there are tariffs. So there are lots of global connectivities that, and you can have lots of air travel at the same time that various governments are subsidizing their different airlines to large extents. That doesn't necessarily bring about a decrease in airline passengers. So I tend to be thinking about that second kind, or sorry, your second kind, my first kind. And so, but I think, yes, so we can probably agree that globalization in your sense is decreasing and globalization in my sense is increasing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jan. Yes, colleagues, you are welcome to make comments and to ask questions.
Can I just say, Alexander, you also made this point about institutional restructuring, so that the ways that we do global coordination, the institutional frameworks through which we do that global coordination are shifting. And I think this is true. That was one of the main points that I tried to make in the presentation. But that process of moving away from traditional multilateralism and moving to new kinds of global cooperation, transgovernmental, informal, multi-stakeholder, and so on, this has been going on for 20-25 years. And I don't see the pandemic as being a little bit what Alexei was saying earlier, A.Gromyko. You know, this pandemic doesn't create new trends so much, but it aggravates trends that were already existing.
But wouldn't this kind of globalization you are talking about, wouldn't it lead in fact to segmentation of the world economy and world politics? Because connectivity can increase in general, but it will not be a uniform increase in different spheres and in different areas.
No, but to my mind, that has always been the case. That's not something new. So in different spheres, there is more connectivity happening and then decreasing in other areas, and we have seen that. We have seen that already. So in finance, there have been greater increases than in migration, and so on. So this would not surprise me. But the areas where there is greater increases, that may be shifting. I think we probably are not going to see air traffic on the same air for quite some time.
It may happen that in some spheres there will be increases, in other spheres there will be setbacks, you know.
Yeah, no, I agree, totally. But I would be surprised, I hear many people also in our earlier seminars in this series talking about, that global supply chains would be under such pressure, and that they would. And I really wonder about that, because the need to have global supply chains in so many areas of production, either because they are so much more efficient, or because they involve materials that are not available otherwise. I mean, if you stop global supply chains, we can all put our mobile phones away, because there's no way to make a mobile phone without a global supply chain. So I just don't see those global supply chains disappearing in quite the way that some earlier speakers have.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, colleagues, you are welcome. If I don't see somebody raising his hand, please just begin speaking.
Alexander Dmitrich,
Yes,
it's the beginning once more.
yes.
Sorry, maybe. Here in Russia, we are hearing about the deglobalization tendency very often the last years. And even before COVID problems. But certainly this tendency is obvious in some maybe political spheres after Donald Trump became president of the United States. But the economic approach gives us some other maybe challenges and other issues to discuss. In the same time, the risks of the international trade and economic and capital export processes is more high nowadays than in the previous decades, even mainly before the recession started, the Great Recession mentioned today, before the crisis 2008, 2009. After that, the rates of the growth of financialization of the movement of capital slowed down, absolutely. But in the same time, the process of the volume change in production, I suppose, is just the same. The return of the production to the national economy basis is only a theoretical approach nowadays. And even in the United States, we have no real big scale results of such policy. The conflict between the United States and China is a fundamental one, for they pretended to become the leaders of them on the market in the political sphere. But it depends of very, very complicated relations, and mainly political ones, than real economic process. For even today, the main part of the China export are going to the United States. It's the biggest partner for China, and China is the biggest market partner for the United States. Only Mexico now is close to China with the quarter of the import in the United States. So it's not this so simple process as deglobalization on all the fronts. It's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You are welcome, colleagues.
Could I ask a question to Jan?
I just say
Yes,
with
please,
to
please.
Dubin, and I agree. I think that was a really good comment. It's so differentiated. It's so differentiated, and you know, in some areas and under some economic indicators, you might talk about a deglobalization, but if you look at ecological problems, if you look at internet communications, if you look at global regulatory arrangements, if you look at numbers of people speaking global language, English, I mean, on a number of other indicators, especially social and political, you can make the argument that globalization is deeper than ever.
Thank you. If I understood correctly, Anton, you wanted to make it.
Yes.
Yes, please do.
I have a question.
Anton Moiseev.
Thank you. I have a question to Jan, please. You have shown us.
Could you, the voice, we cannot hear you.
Oh, so I'll try to.
Could you make it louder?
It is better? It is
Yes.
better? Okay, great. So you have shown us the charts of the disposition of the elites and of the governments towards globalization in different areas. And while in taxation, most people are inclined to leave that for the national governments, well, it's understandable. In health issues, most people probably trust World Health Organization or supranational organizations. That's also understandable. But there was also trade, which was always in the middle. And as I quoted, it was divided kind of half by half. So how do you interpret that? Do half of the people believe that it should be managed at the supranational level, global level, and half of the people believe it should be managed, the trade should be managed at national level? Or do people believe that it should be managed equally at the national and supranational level? So what's your interpretation of these results? Thank you.
Jan, switch on your microphone, please. Your microphone is switched off.
You turn on your microphone. Mike.
Jan.
Jan, we don't hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was looking back at my graphs and I was having a hard time getting back to Zoom. No, thank you, Anton. I think the figures with trade are quite mixed, as you say. In fact, slightly different. The inclination to look to global and regional arrangements for trade is stronger than for health overall across the different countries. So that was slightly different. The areas which are even stronger than trade for regional and global governance are environment and human rights. But trade actually comes third in general. It varies between the countries though. And I think what you probably see is and it, like you say, it's about 50-50. And maybe that is kind of reflecting a general disagreement amongst elites today, that some of them are following the traditional liberal open world economy kind of thinking about trade. And then there's a whole other group of elites who are thinking in terms of protectionist, nationally oriented approaches to trade. And there's maybe a split between that, and that maybe is reflected in these differences. I should say that when we talk here about elites, we were interviewing politicians, we were interviewing bureaucrats, we were interviewing business people, we were interviewing academics, civil society leaders, and media, news media people. So again, it might be that the differences, I didn't break it down by sector, but it could be interesting to look and see whether business people have more inclination to want regional and global regulation, for example, as compared with politicians. But those are calculations I haven't done. But it's a good idea, I probably should.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, the results you presented today, Jan, were extremely interesting, and very good job was done, no doubt, no doubt.
Well, thank you.
So we all enjoyed it, really. Please, colleagues, would somebody like to make a comment or put a question to our speakers? Victor Boris, would you like to say something? It seems to me that you are looking at me, and I feel that you want to say something.
Do you know, Alexander Dmitrievich, as always, you are absolutely right. Yeah. No, of course, we had two very interesting, all-embracing, and deep presentation, and it gives a lot of food for our thinking. My feeling is that, of course, it's difficult to discuss all these topics right now, because the reason is very simple. There is so lot uncertain, so lot unknown. We are in the midst of crisis, and it's really difficult to understand how it will go out. I think, and at the same time, our talk, our discussion is very needed right now, because we cannot lose time. We have to start our discussion of all these topics. But I prefer to be at firm ground. That probably it's to be on firm ground is probably to make, to say, to emphasize what we know for certain. No, first of all, the impact, I mean economic impact of this crisis will be huge. On our previous session, Alexei Kireev has said, has emphasized that global GDP will lose around 1/10 of it. It is around 10 trillion of American dollars. It's a big sum, very big. What it can mean? No, I think we have to start probably from the same consultation which Alexei Anatolyevich started. We had some world, the world who was managed and directed in some way. I mean, the three main characteristics of this world was such. No, first of all, it's about global power. Second is about global wealth. And third is about the main key players in this world. And what we can say just now, that in global wealth, I started with it, we have a huge losses. 1/10 of global GDP will be lost, and probably more. Who will take the main part of it? I think we know now for certain. West, collective West will take it. It will be United States, Western Europe, the main part. The third player, China, will go rather well, as it has gone through crisis during 2008, 2009. I think this is important. Second, the world which was before and in which I think we live now, it was, I mean Russian, we were not very enthusiastic about it. But of course it was unipolar world. it was what? It was Western creation with decisive role of United States. And now it is not so clear because, as I said, West, collective West, and probably mostly United States are losing their wealth. Secondly, I think not very quickly, but they are losing their power. Of course, in the world, we know that now there are, can I say, they are not anti-systemic players, but they are non-systemic players. I mean, China, Russia, and some other countries. Probably not, of course, not so big, not so powerful, not so influential, but powers which you have to count with. Iran, North Korea, Cuba, sometimes Venezuela. It does not change the overall balance of power, but it means a lot that old system of power is not working in the same way as it was before. I think this crisis, coronavirus crisis, will strengthen, will further this tendency. Of course, we know that can be two kinds of reaction on the part of the West, which has now most cards in his hands. No, first of all, to try to revise it, to restore the old order. I suppose it's impossible. I think it's game which you cannot win. But of course, we see that now United States and to much lesser extent West Europe is trying to do namely it. But second, to accept the situation and to try to go out with minimal losses. One of the big unknown just now is, of course, presidential campaign and the outcome of presidential election in the United States. At the beginning of the year, it was clear that President Trump will be re-elected. Now I'm not so sure. No, of course, we have to wait, hear the opinion of academician Rogov. But now I'm not so sure. It can change. It can change. A picture can change considerably. Because
you're not sure about my opinion or what? You're not sure about my opinion or what?
I am not sure about your opinion. And I am not sure now about outcome. I am not sure that he will prevail. Now I can rule out the possibility that he will lose. And I think it's very important. I think it's very important. And we don't know. We have to wait. We don't know which will be outcome in internal discussion and, can I say, in internal struggle. Alexei Anatolyevich knows it much better than I know with the European Union. What it means, how they will see their future, to what extent they will they will think that their future is tightly connected with United States. Are they ready to play more autonomous role? Big question. And then about China. China is a very important player. China was played big, can I say, huge and constructive role during crisis 2008-2009. And now, in this situation, are China ready to continue this line? What decision they can take? Because I think it's very dangerous to try to marginalize China now I think it's really impossible, but it's a very dangerous game. We have to see some kind of place which deserve this huge, enormous country. It's enormous superpower. It's clear about it. And for this reason, of course, I have not any answer because I have not magic ball to see future through it. Of course, I have a lot of questions. I think we have to continue our dialogue. We have tried to expand it because all is really intertwined, especially world economy and world politics, because very intertwined the question of world wealth and world power. I see many things will depend how the main players, the key players, will see the best outcome for their countries and then for themselves. I think it's better for me to stop right here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Viktor Borisovich. Yes, Sergei Mikhailovich Rogov raises his hand. He has no other option right now.
Yeah. First of all, don't blame me for electing Trump. As you know, it was Putin, not Sergei Rogov.
Now, yes.
It was Putin, not Sergei Rogov, who elected him in 2016, right? Well, that's not me. But speaking about the discussion today, I'm very much impressed by the two excellent reports, excellent presentations. And of course, some of the points which I wanted to make were stolen for me by the two speakers this afternoon. But I still have a few points which I hope to present next week. And I hope that my internet service will be okay, because the previous 3 days I spent like Robinson Crusoe on an island under the house arrest and without internet and TV, etc. And that, by the way, is one of the points which I'm going to make next time, because the entire way of life which we got used to and saw as a normal and irreversible has been shaken. Just as these 3 days, as if, well, we are in the beginning of the 19th century, without modern communications, without modern interaction, and all of a sudden the open society is becoming closed. When we don't shake hands, when we meet our friends, we look at them as enemies. Keep away from me. And that's, of course, maybe an emotional reaction. But the main point is that there are many irreversible changes taking place as a result of the present crisis. There will be no return to business as usual. Of course, some fundamentals will stay, some fundamentals will remain. But just as the budget deficit and the huge governmental debt, apparently the not liberal, it's a libertarian dogma about the budget deficits is forgotten. Now it's spend, spend, spend. And it will be very difficult to cut those expenditures when hopefully the epidemic is over, because the crisis demonstrated that the health system which exist today, even in developed countries, turned out to be completely inefficient, in particular in the United States with their huge, huge expenditures on health. It turns out that, well, there have been some fundamental changes in the industrial areas, because manufacturing has been so badly hit by the crisis. And apparently, when the factories will resume their operations, there will be many more robots doing what the human beings were doing today. Because, well, the robots are not poisoned by the COVID-19. Of course, well, there are hackers which can put a different virus into robots, but that process of robotization started before, but now it's getting a huge new impulse. And there are also some other issues, but when we were talking about huge numbers, like $1 trillion, $3 trillion, etc., how much money it's necessary to spend to deal with those questions before the crisis? Well, we could have spent 10 times less or maybe 100 times less to resolve some of the problems which we ignored because we were doing business as usual. And we spent money on the arms race. Did the arms race, did those weapons which we accumulated prevented the coronavirus? No. Did those weapons prevent the United States from 9/11? No. Did those weapons prevent all of us from the global climate changes? No. And I wonder, when you talk about, I'm addressing Professor Sholte about the debate on new priorities. It's high time to start the debate on what are real national security priorities. Maintaining huge nuclear arsenals and destroying the remnants of the nuclear arms control, which seem to be quite possible, or reorienting the resources for what are the real priorities. Apparently, Alexander, I made my presentation for the next week, so, well, you have to look for another speaker again.
Oh, no, you have no excuse. You'll be a speaker next time. Thank you, Sergey. Thank you so much.
I'm enjoying life
yes,
on the ocean bay.
Yes, yes.
Under the palm tree.
Palmas und cañas.
Okay. Dear friends, we've been working for 2 hours. If somebody would like to say something or to put questions, you are welcome. If not, no? I don't see anybody raising his hand. No. Then I think that we have to thank our speakers today. They did marvelous job, and we all enjoyed this discussion. And thank you for everybody who attended this conference, and those, of course, who took an active part in it. Thank you so much.
Special thanks to Alexei and Jan.
Sure. Thank you so much. Hope to see you next Tuesday. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Спасибо, пока.
Пока.